Greetings, my name is Monty Martin.
And I'm Kelly McLaughlin.
And we are the Dungeon Dudes. And today we're going to talk about common misconceptions that people have about being a DM that often is a bit of a mental block that prevents you from taking up the mantle and running a game for yourself.
There's a lot of people out there who, when I ask if they ever wanted to jump into the DM seat, go, oh no, I don't think I could handle that. And they have a lot of preconceived fears and ideas on what being a DM means. So today we're going to talk about the top 5 misconceptions that people have about jumping into the DM seat and hopefully convince some of you out there that maybe it is the right time to try out DMing. There's a lot to discuss today, so let's get rolling.
Before we talk about the misconceptions, we do want to clarify one thing. Our Kickstarter campaign, Monsters of Drakkenheim, is heading into its final hours. So if you want to get in on this amazing Kickstarter project with over 150 new monsters for your D&D games, follow the links down in the description below.
If you are thinking of jumping into the DM seat, one thing you're going to want is a whole lot of monsters. And if you want to get the best out of your monsters, we highly recommend checking out our book, because not only is it jam-packed with monsters based on Eldritch horror, but it introduces brand new crafting systems for your game, as well as new conditions and epic boss rules that make boss battles with a solo monster much more exciting.
Plus, we've packed every monster entry full of lore, adventure hooks, and combat tactics so that all the monsters are really easy to use and integrate into your games, whether you're running our classic Dungeons of Drakkenheim adventure or a campaign of your very own creation. Follow the links right down below to back the Kickstarter before it ends. And with that, let's clear up some misconceptions.
So the first misconception that we're going to talk about is that it's the DM's main job to challenge the players.
This is the classic players versus dungeon master mindset, and the internet often creates a lot of pressure on DMs to make their games suitably difficult, especially from old school or power players. And so many dungeon masters or would-be dungeon masters are worried about, am I going to be able to challenge my players? Is it just going to be way too easy for them? Is it going to be too difficult? I don't think I'm up for that kind of players versus DM antagonistic role.
The DM's role is more so facilitating interactions and storytelling, not just creating challenges. There's actually a fine line between a rewarding challenge, a frustrating slog, and a miserable experience.
A lot of new DMs feel the urge that they need to counter or shut down players' special powers, spells, and class features, even when they're not expecting them.
Even if it feels to you like your players are having a cakewalk, chances are they're having a wonderful time. I've experienced this a lot when I was a new DM and players steamrolled over my encounters and I thought I was doing a bad job. But if you aren't sure if your game is difficult enough, ask them. It was the time that I actually asked my players, hey, did you guys have fun tonight? And it turns out that they had the best time utterly destroying my dragon encounter.
At the core of this misconception, ultimately, is that the DM's role is mostly to be about facilitating combat encounters or role-playing puzzles and challenges, when there's so much more to the role of the DM. And oftentimes, the combat in a D&D campaign can be pretty easy, but it can still be a fun and meaningful experience for everyone at the table, because everyone is interested in more than just the battles. They're invested in the storytelling, the role-playing, and all the other social interactions that are happening at the table.
Learning to create proper challenges for your players is something that you are going to gain over the years of experience. In my opinion, it's best to start on the easier side, and if the players are steamrolling it, you know to up the difficulty a little bit next time. But also, it's okay to have some encounters be really easy and some of them a little more difficult. This creates excitement at the table.
Now, the next misconception, and this is a huge one that stops people from becoming DMs in the first place, in some cases even from getting into the game at all. And this is the idea that the dungeon master has to have every single rule in the game completely committed to memory. You need to have this like encyclopedic knowledge of every monster, every spell, every class feature, everything. And if you ever get a single rule wrong, you're a bad DM and you shouldn't be DMing. That's just not true.
We all make rules mistakes. We all get rules wrong from time to time. But you don't need to have an encyclopedic memory for the rules. We actually did a video on the key parts of the books that are useful for DMs to read through. You can check that out up over there. But this video details that there are certain sections that you need to have a better grasp on than others. But even then, memorizing everything is just going to be mostly impossible unless you have a photographic memory and can memorize a whole book.
And the truth of the matter is that, well, a firm grasp of the rules really helps a lot. You as the Dungeon Master do not need to memorize every single class feature, feat, and spell, especially when it comes to the player's abilities. Whenever you encounter something that you're not sure how it works, like the player is casting a spell you've never seen before, all you really need to do is ask them to read the full text of that ability out in the moment, and then you and everyone at the table can figure it out together.
In my opinion, during a game, you should never spend more than 1 minute looking up a rule in the books. A DM's job is to make rulings, not rules. Obviously, knowing the rules is better, but once you have a grasp on how the game system works, you can make rulings that lend themselves to the fun at the table. If you aren't sure whether the rule works one way or the other in the moment, you can roll a d6 or flip a coin, and then after the game, look it up and check the rules. It's fine to say it's going to work like this time, but let's check afterwards to see if that's how it actually works. I do this a lot at my table, and then afterwards we'll look up the rule and say, okay, so I let it slide a little bit looser this time, but going forward, we're going to run it as depicted in the book. Or sometimes I even say, hey, I don't really like the way that the book says, and I prefer the way we're running it, so let's keep doing that.
Yeah, it's really common for a lot of Dungeon Masters, especially new Dungeon Masters, to feel really self-conscious if a player calls you out or corrects you on a rule. My advice there is to recognize the positive intent often behind that, and as long as players are being respectful about it, there's no need for you to get embarrassed if that does occur. But at the same time, as the DM, you have the final say on how the rules work in play, and you are empowered to use your judgment and your logic in the moment to decide how to apply the rules. Obviously, you want to be consistent and fair when you're doing this, but if you want to make a ruling that contradicts something in the book, you can do that. It's best if you have a good reason for doing so, but you can. And so it's that discussion between you and the players is always permitted. And over time, you're going to get a better grasp for this, a better grasp for the nuance, and be able to make those rulings with confidence and learn from your mistakes when they happen.
The third misconception is that DMing is a ton of work since the DM needs to create everything from scratch. But it doesn't have to be. Every D&D game is unique because of the blend of the player characters, their actions that they choose to do, and the DM's rulings on those situations. You don't have to go far to find the different stories behind so many groups playing the same adventure.
It's easy to believe that as a dungeon master, you have to do a ton of game prep work before you can even start your campaign. I've heard from dungeon masters who have planned out entire level 1 to 20 campaigns before they've even started their first session of the game. And that is putting a ton of pressure on yourself, putting a ton of work on yourself that really and truly is just not necessary. Of course, everyone's going to find their own balance of how much preparation they need to do to confidently run their games. But in many cases, it's a lot less than you might be expecting. And there is a shared responsibility between you and the players to create that material that makes the game run.
At the table, storytelling is actually a shared experience. Yes, it's the DM's job to lay out the situations that are unfolding at the table, and it's the players' jobs to interact with those situations. But I have found that the greatest lesson that I learned as a DM was when I was able to sit back and let the narrative go where the players were going to push it. Yes, I had directions that I wanted to push them in, and I learned the nuance of how to get them there, but I got just as excited riffing on ideas with my players when they would say, hey, what if we blow up this mountaintop to cause an avalanche? And I get to say, oh, cool. How are we going to do that? Let's talk about it at the table. You can actually work with your players to shape the narrative. You can use the players' backstories as material to inspire adventures and NPCs. Players love it when the campaign is about them. So if you work together in a session 0 to decide who the characters are, what NPCs are important for their backgrounds, and who they became before setting out on this adventure, you can take those NPCs, you can take those plot hooks, you can take those elements and bring them to life in the adventure. This is going to make it much more exciting for them, and it also means that the player characters are helping imply certain elements of the existing narrative.
The mountain of work that you have to do to prepare your game can really get yourself in a mental rut, especially if you believe that you have to be wholly original and wow your players with a story that they've never heard before. But don't forget, the greatest authors and storytellers have borrowed material from history, mythology, and popular stories of their day, and you can too. Draw on source material that you love from your favorite video games, movies, television shows, comic books, fantasy novels, and more. And it's often okay for you to lift those things whole cloth and adapt them to your campaign. And in many cases, your players might not even notice that you're actually just completely riffing off the Lord of the Rings.
And really, when you do this, one of two things is going to occur. Either the players, like Monty said, never notice and think you're a great storyteller, or they do notice and they love the trope that they're getting to be a part of. In our actual play series, we did an entire arc inspired by The Thing. It was super obvious to me that we were doing The Thing, and I immediately got so excited to participate in the D&D version that I knew Monty was going to adapt in his own way, that I was going to interact with in my own way at the table. It wasn't going to be the movie The Thing. It was going to be our retelling of that story based on what a sorcerer in that situation would do, which makes it much more interesting.
And don't shy away from using pre-made campaigns, modules, and other resources, especially things like maps and artwork. You don't have to use an entire adventure either. You can use parts of it. You might pull the tavern locations out of Curse of Strahd and adapt those taverns into your own campaign world and completely unrelated to Ravenloft. Or maybe you decide, you want to have a vampire that is kind of like Strahd, but you're not going to do the whole Strahd von Zarovich storyline. They're just going to be this cool NPC that lives in a creepy castle the characters are going to interact with in a completely different way. And when you do this, when you remove something that inspires you or interests you from its original context, the process of doing that makes it your own. It makes it original. Originality and creativity can sometimes come from taking an existing thing and situating it in a different context.
Misconception number 4, the DM is responsible for the player's fun. If the players didn't have fun, the DM did something wrong.
The inverse of this is that we often are told that the metric on whether or not you did a good job as a DM is whether or not your players had fun. And I appreciate the sentiment of that. But the fact of the matter is there's actually a ton of things that are beyond your direct control that might mean the players don't have fun playing the game. Your players not having fun might not actually be your fault and might not be an indicator that you did a bad job as a DM at all.
I am not a therapist. I think I'm pretty good at talking to people about social situations, but I'm not an expert in it. And it's not my responsibility to navigate the social dynamic at the table at all times. Yes, I'm often the host. Yes, I'm often including all of these people here, and it's my job to engage them in the social dynamic of D&D. But everyone's responsible for creating a kind and welcoming environment for the other players. And the DM is a player too in this instance. You can have problematic players. You can have players arguing at the table. And the thought that it's the DM's responsibility to handle that and take care of that is a lot of pressure. But we're all human beings. We're all adults. I mean, some of us might be playing this as kids, but we're all functioning human beings who can think things through, have discussions, and it's not the DM's responsibility to monitor and take care of everybody.
I'm not a huge fan in general of the phrase, it's the DM's job too, because the Dungeon Master isn't a service provider. They often have a lot other on their plate, and I think that the players have their own responsibilities in this too. On a similar note, I think that fun is not the only metric for whether or not a role-playing game session was a rewarding experience. Some of my best games of D&D ended in all the players at the table in tears. I wouldn't necessarily call that fun, but everybody was, for lack of a better term, everybody really got a lot out of that game session. A horror game session is not necessarily fun and farts and lollipops. It can be really mentally exhilarating. It can be exciting, but we might not use the word fun to describe that. So I think that it's a bit of a misconception that the game is always about fun. It certainly can be, and I think for a lot of groups, that's all the game ever needs to be. But the idea that that's the only thing that people might want to get out of the game session, and that that's the only or the best metric for success as a dungeon master, I think is a bit of a not entirely true.
And that it's all up to the DM to create those scenarios. Some of the best moments at our table that, to go along with what you're saying, that weren't about fun, but were about the drama, the stakes, the impact of the things occurring, were 15 to 20 minutes where you didn't say a word. And the three characters role-played about a situation, a decision, something that had to be done. And that created tension. We had a situation for an upcoming Drakenheim episode that was tension formed completely by the three characters at the table that resulted in a lot of emotion.
And that was completely beyond my control as the dungeon master. That was something that was initiated by the players and their choices and their interactions as their characters, that I think everyone came away from that session feeling very heavy, but that wasn't me as the DM that necessarily made that happen. That was the compound effect of everything that occurred during the session. And I even had to check myself as a DM, and I had to reassure the rest of my players of being like, this was a cool moment. This was really interesting. This was like the dark night of the soul for the player characters. And that was still a special and really rewarding game session, even if I wouldn't call it fun in the typical sense. So be open-minded to these types of things, and don't necessarily make fun your responsibility or the sole bar for deciding whether your game is a good game.
And in the topic of the responsibility of the DM, this brings us to our final misconception. The Dungeon Master is responsible for organizing everything.
So often the DM is expected to be the host, the scheduling master, the cook, the cleaner, the therapist to the group, to be the one, the recruiter, to be the set builder, to be the one that transports everything, to be the one that brings the book, to be the one that provides the pro Roll20 account, or that gets the D&D Beyond subscription and shares the campaign for everybody, to be the person who bought all the miniatures and ordered all the Hero Forge. I've seen so many dungeon masters that go as far as like they manage and print out their players' character sheets for them. I've been this DM.
I have too.
That I was always leveling up the characters for them. I was making sure that everybody had dice and pencils. And like, that's an okay thing to do when you're introducing brand new players into the game. But I've been that DM doing that for a group that I was running a game for 2 years. That's a lot of responsibility to have on your shoulders, in addition to running the game and planning the sessions.
If you're a player at the table and there's something that you want to see more of at your gaming table, you could be the one to bring that. If you are thinking to yourself, man, the DM's not supplying enough snacks, it doesn't necessarily mean it's the DM's responsibility. You can be the one to bring snacks. Mm-hmm. You can be the one to DJ the soundtrack. You could be the one to encourage the team to roleplay at the table. There are countless things that the players can and should be responsible for handling. Probably one of the biggest ones is cleaning up after the game
Oh
session.
man, yes. If the DM is also the host, it's a huge gesture of respect to stick around after the game session to help clean up, pack up the minis, do the dishes together. These are all huge things that, like, I think a lot of DMs that host their games at home, that doesn't necessarily get thought of. But even if you're playing online, there's so many other things that you can do together. Like, as a player, you can be the one that is responsible for taking notes and sharing those between sessions. Players can be the ones that coordinate scheduling. There are so many other responsibilities that the DM doesn't have to be solely responsible for. And the more players take those responsibilities and share responsibilities, I feel like the more ownership they feel like they have over the whole game experience as well.
The game of D&D becomes its best when everybody at the table is sharing in the experience. Yes, the DM is the storyteller, but the story is woven through the narratives of the player characters. They're the main characters, and if you think of all of your favorite stories that you've heard, they're often told through the lens of those main characters. The DM's simply laying the groundwork in front of them. And this goes outside of just the game table. The DM might be the host. They might be the one dictating the rules of the game, and they might be the one facilitating the story. But that doesn't mean they need to be the one who cleans up everything, sets up everything, manages everything at the table, is expected to keep everybody on pace and focused and friendly and working together. It is a shared effort. And at the end of the day, the DM is taking on a lot. And so these are the 5 misconceptions, but there is a final note that we want to say, and that is when you are finishing up a game session, you're helping your DM clean up, you're helping put things away, you should also take the time to thank them. This is something that we've started doing at every single one of our sessions. We always thank Monty.
Or whoever's running the game.
Or whoever's running the game.
Unfortunately, one of the things that is true is that sometimes DMing can be thankless. And there can be a certain element to DMing that happens sometimes where you as a DM feel like you are putting in so much effort into the game and the players aren't matching that effort back to you. And this can be one of the most heartbreaking experiences for a new dungeon master in particular, one who's got a bunch of friends who haven't maybe been into RPGs before and don't realize that there's so much that is happening in the DM's responsibility. And this is why we do think it's important to clear up these misconceptions right away and encourage even new players to participate more in the organization and creation and in that storytelling that occurs at the table. This is a huge way to show your gratitude through your actions instead of just your words. And I think that when everybody comes together and contributes to the experience of a role-playing game, you end up with such a more satisfying experience because it really builds that trust and camaraderie that makes these games so special.
If you are jumping into a new D&D game with a new group, I think that there's value in everybody trying their hand at DMing. It's probably one of the best ways to thank your dungeon master is to step into that seat, see what it feels like, see what it takes. And yes, there are a lot of misconceptions and it's not as daunting as you think, but there still is a lot to it. And knowing what goes into DMing means that you are better equipped to thank your dungeon master for the work that they do put in. They do a lot of work to bring the world to life that day. And sometimes a simple thank you, a warm hug, or a crisp high five can go a long way. So if you have any other major misconceptions as a newer dungeon master or a veteran dungeon master that you experienced, tell us about those misconceptions and how much fun you've actually had DMing in the comments below.
The videos that we create on our channel are made possible thanks to the incredible generosity of our Patreon supporters. If you enjoy the work that we do here on YouTube, please consider supporting the channel by becoming a patron. The links are right down below.
And if you want to see the greatest DM on the internet, in my opinion. You should check out our actual play in the Worlds of Drakenheim, which airs Tuesday evenings right here on YouTube. You can check out all the previous episodes right up over here.
You're too kind. And if you want to see the greatest D&D player getting some fantastic advice on how to make your own characters, we got plenty more content on that right up over here.
Please like our video, subscribe to the channel, and ring that bell so that you never miss an episode.
Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you next time
in the dungeon.